Kalam dia telespectadores GMN TV ouvintes Nacional FM no Maluk Siranebe acompanha live streaming programa idane tanto husi railiur no mos railaran. Hasoro malu fali hohau Francis Suni iha programa Grande Entrevista iha date kanal GMN Lori Timor Bumundo. Ouvintes telespectadores, ohin lorong Timor-Leste comemora lorong importante ida lorong bot ida nebe determina ni destino nusar nação ida nudar povo ida. Ia 30 de agosto 1999, povo Timor nebe ia momento neba bele ona vota hakat ba centro votação sira no vota hodi hili atu ukun rasikan. Tamane o inkalan ia edisaung idane marca una presenza ia studio GMN Bebora. Ema ida nebe ia momento neba lidera misaung ida nebe karik baraku sita fiar katak misaung ida nebe impossible, misaung ida nebe todan, no misaung ida nebe la fácil. Ema ida nebe iha pressão no ameaça ni uing, hamrik firme na fating ho povo Timor hodi decide ninia destino. Ema ida nebe nunca haluha povo Timor. Mas que nia misaung nebe ni halau iharai ida ne la lais date, mai be to uhin lorong la haluha, itamba ida ne ba komemorasaung lorong referendum tinang ne nia mai fali Timor hodi assiste sa ida makita halo hodi komemora lorong importante ida ne. Ouvintes telespectadores, iteneban bainaka o hingkalan mag Senyor Ian Martin nebe uluk lidera misaung UNAMET iha Timor-Leste. Welcome and thank you, sir, for making your time to do this interview.
Thank you.
Let's start this conversation with your visit. For how many times have you come back to Timor-Leste since the referendum in '99?
I think this is the 8th time. The last one was in 2019 when the 20th anniversary of the referendum, the popular consultation, was celebrated. So it's just 5 years since I was here last. But I like to think I've never really lost contact completely with the country that I was privileged to know in the extraordinary times of the referendum.
And what have you seen this time? What has changed in your view since your last visit in 2019? Since we had COVID obviously for 2 years, and then everyone sort of felt like everything stopped, and then we started again. For Timor, obviously, it's slower than many other countries. So, what can you say for this time?
I've only made one little short trip outside Dili, and one should never really judge a country entirely on its capital. Obviously, here in Dili, one sees changes all the time, and it's a great pleasure to visit this fine television studio and see how things are advancing. But of course, one of the things that I'm struck by on each visit is how much the population is now a young population, a growing population and a young population. And it's great to see, as I see here, young people developing technical skills to apply them to work in the country. But it's also a huge challenge for the country, I think, to be able to ensure that there are jobs and services and quality of education and health service for a growing population. So. And I think also it's a challenge to keep alive the memory of what was involved in giving birth to an independent country.
In the last few days since you've been in Dili, what have you seen in Dili? Is there any significant change that you notice in, particularly in Dili?
There's a lot more cars and motorcycles on the street than I'm familiar with, and of course the public buildings are developing all the time. But as I say, I note particularly the youth and vigor of the population.
Let's go back I guess it would be interesting since we have not heard from you for a number of years now. I always wonder, as the head of the mission, a mission that was not easy. How was it like when you led the team of UNAMET, as the #1 person in the country? Personally, how was it like?
We knew, the headquarters of the United Nations knew that it was going to be an enormous challenge. One of the challenges was the time period, because President Habibie, in agreeing to the referendum, had insisted on a ballot in August. Indeed, the 8th of August was the original intention. And there were people at United Nations headquarters who thought it was simply impossible to get a mission on the ground and all the necessary logistics and personnel and so on in such a short time scale. So that was a challenge. But the biggest challenge really was security, because already while the 5th of May agreement was being negotiated, the situation in East Timor, as it then was, had become quite violent. The systematic organization of militia groups across the country had seen massacres in Lakeisha, here in Dili. So we knew that we were coming into difficult security conditions. There were people who said there really ought to be a UN peacekeeping presence to ensure a peaceful vote. That wasn't possible. There was no way that President Habibie could have agreed to that. So it was Indonesia, the Indonesian police, who were made responsible for security. We only had some unarmed police officers and a few military liaison officers to keep contact and advise them. But we knew security was going to be a big challenge, and so it was, right through to the ballot and beyond.
And as a person, what did you feel when you first time knew that you would be heading the mission? On a personal level, how did you react to that? How did you see the mission?
I was very pleased to be asked to head the mission. I didn't know a great deal about East Timor, but I had worked at Amnesty International. And at Amnesty International we had followed the situation and indeed done our best to report publicly on human rights violations during the occupation, made annual statements at the United Nations in the Decolonization Committee, took up the situation after the Santa Cruz massacre in what was then the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. So I had some knowledge. I had met the man who today is your president, Jose Ramos Horta, when he was involved in the diplomatic lobbying for East Timor at the United Nations. So I had a little knowledge and certainly a great concern that once there was agreement on carrying out the popular consultation, a referendum, that should be carried out in a way that genuinely allowed the Timorese to express their wishes. So yes, it was a heavy responsibility, and I was very soon briefed on the challenges we were going to face, but it's still one that I was really pleased to have been asked to take on, and that certainly remains how I feel today.
Once you arrived in Timor, do you think that what happened in the field, what happened in Timor at the time, was what you expected? Was there anything that you thought wouldn't happen, but it ended up happening in Timor?
We certainly did know that the operation of militia, who were really under the direction of elements of the Indonesian army, the TNI, was going to be a big challenge, that people who supported independence were already being intimidated and in some cases attacked. We had the responsibility to try to create a level playing field so that both those in favour of autonomy within Indonesia and those in favour of independence had an opportunity to campaign. We knew, I think, how difficult that was going to be. I think the arrival of UNAMET had some immediate positive impact on the situation, and of course then other international observers began to arrive, election observers from different countries, tremendous interest from the international media as we got closer and closer towards the date of the ballot. So that meant that the international eyes and ears in some way inhibited those who were committing human rights violations, but it never calmed down completely. And when we had to decide to open registration, that was a difficult decision for the UN. There was a lot of discussion. There were those who thought that we shouldn't proceed while things were still so dangerous for many people. So significant numbers were already internally displaced. But after a lot of discussion, Secretary General Kofi Annan decided we should open registration. And that was a moment when, in my opinion, the determination and courage of the people of East Timor drove the process forward, because we didn't know whether people would dare to come forward and register, but very soon they did, and they did so in numbers that were even greater than our electoral experts had predicted. So then we were convinced that we should go forward. We were in constant consultation with Shanala Gusmao in his prison house in Jakarta. I visited him several times, so we were constantly seeking his judgment as to whether it was right to go forward. And that became even more of an issue as we got closer to the ballot, because the CNRT opened offices, began open campaigning. Several of those offices were attacked, and individuals were under threat. There were rumours, even some documents that suggested that preparations were being made to disrupt the ballot violently. We, right through to polling day, didn't know whether it would be a peaceful day. We were making efforts to ensure that the Indonesian army and Falentil talked to each other, and indeed on the eve of the ballot there was agreement that they had reached that arms would be kept in cantonments and barracks. There were also efforts to ensure that both those who supported remaining in Indonesia and supported independence would meet as soon as the ballot took place. Shanala Gusmao said there'll be no winners, no losers. People from both sides should cooperate in a peaceful transition. So we went forward, and polling day itself, the 30th of August 1999, was an extraordinarily peaceful day. There were a few polling stations that were disrupted and we had to close and reopen. But in fact, not only did everybody have the opportunity to vote, just about everybody did vote. And we estimated that 50 or 60% of those who had registered were lined up waiting to cast their votes at 6 o'clock in the morning when the polls opened. By midday, there were polling stations where every single registered elector had voted, and in the end, more than 98% voted, which is normally when you hear that 98% have voted, you think the government is making it up. But in this particular case, this was the truth. But at the very end of that day, there were attacks on ballot boxes. 2 of our national staff were killed. The first of, in the end, 14 UNAMET national staff who were murdered by militia. But there was still an uneasy calm while we carried out the count. And so the next question was, would the count be disrupted or attacked by those who didn't want, who suspected there had been a vote for independence? But the count went forward without disruption. On the 3rd of September, we knew we had completed the count and were ready to announce the result. That evening in New York, Secretary General Kofi Annan announced the result, and I announced it simultaneously at 9 a.m. on the 4th of September in what was then the Makota Hotel, today the Hotel Timor, and we announced to the world that 78.6% of the population had voted for separation, for independence.
As a Timorese who wanted independence, I personally was in the view that the pro-independence was the majority. However, it was the majority that was being suppressed so much. So, as the head of the UN mission, did you feel, did you have any sort of inclination or any sort of feeling that the vote was going to be won by the pro-independence group? And was there any pressure against you to sort of not to give the opportunity for that to happen in Timor?
It wasn't our job to predict the result of the vote. You know, sometimes people say the United Nations brought independence. We brought self-determination. It was the people of Timor that decided that self-determination meant an expression of their desire for independence. So we weren't trying to predict the outcome, but of course we were a mission that became very close to the people during those days. Not so much myself in our headquarters in Dili, but our district electoral officers who were out in the villages, public education teams that were making sure that both the process and the decision was understood. Our police officers who were trying to ensure that the Indonesian police contained violence by militia. We were a mission that became extremely close, and therefore I think most members of the mission came to understand that almost certainly was a majority of the people who wanted independence. But as I say, that was not our business. Our business was to ensure that the people of East Timor could vote as freely as possible. And of course there were those who feared that the intimidation might mean that people would be coerced, even if they wanted independence, to vote otherwise. But Shalanda Gusmao in particular was always confident that CNRT campaigning wasn't really even necessary. He was confident that people would have the courage and the determination to vote the way they wanted, and that's what we saw. People who had already gone to the hills because of the violence came back down. We made it possible for them to register anywhere, not necessarily in their home villages. Came down, voted, and in some cases went straight back into hiding because they correctly feared that more violence was going to come. It was an extraordinary display of courage, but we were not conducting opinion polls and wondering what the outcome would be, and we were simply trying to create the best opportunity we could for people to make their own choice.
And maybe because it was so apparent that the majority of the people were sort of wanting their independence, then it must have made you one of the least favorite person by the anti-independence authority. Did you ever feel that you were not really welcomed by the group that did not support independence for Timor-Leste?
I think there were different attitudes amongst those who wanted East Timor to remain in Indonesia. There were some who were reasonably willing to accept the rules of democracy, and some of them believed that in fact, right till the eve of poll, that Timorese would vote to remain with Indonesia. But there are others who were clearly coercing a vote, and there were some dirty tricks to accuse UNAMET of rigging the ballot, and unfortunately that narrative is still to some extent alive in Indonesia today, and some of the Indonesian army officers who have written their accounts of 1999 have still accused UNAMET of in some way rigging the ballot. In fact, there was firstly we were under close observation by many international observers, all of whom said that this had been a fair poll, and any unfairness had been the coercion by those who were opposed to the independence vote. But there was even a hearing, and some complaints were brought forward. Those were heard by the Independent Electoral Commission of 3 people who had been appointed to, we, UNAMET, were under scrutiny because we were the electoral authority, but there were independent electoral experts and observers who were watching us, and they overwhelmingly spoke very positively about the manner in which, the fairness with which the ballot had been conducted. But yeah, there were those who accused UNAMET of rigging, and worse, there were attacks on UNAMET itself before the ballot, let alone the violence after the ballot. Our office in Maliana was attacked at one point, our office in Vikeke. There were brief periods when we had to withdraw staff from those places. So we were always somewhat under threat and certainly under criticism. But I think the historical record is clear. Certainly internationally, it was immediately clear to the international community that this had been a genuine expression of the will of the Timorese.
With the militia groups formed just with the objective of trying to disrupt the process of referendum, elements of these groups were forced pro-Indonesian, pro-independence supporters. How much information did you know about this group and what was really happening in terms of the militia groups being formed by I guess the elements of Indonesian army in Timor at the time?
We knew a lot, and of course we knew a bit before we started, and we learned more when we were on the ground. One of the first things that happened to me was one of the first times I went out of Dili, I stumbled across the TNI training a group of militia, within sight of the roadside. And as time went on, because we had teams on the ground, we had a small but very well-informed political team who had local languages. Our police and military were in regular liaison with the Indonesian police and military. So and people gave us a lot of information, spoke to us, of course. And we put that information repeatedly to the Indonesian authorities. I mean, I would go several times a week, probably, to protest to the Indonesian task force, which represented the Indonesian government here, to the most senior Indonesian military officer here, and say this is what is happening. And on one occasion I flew to Jakarta to put to General Ranto himself our evidence that senior TNI officers were involved in actually organising militia violence against people. So we didn't know everything, but we certainly gained quite a considerable understanding as to what was really going on.
Was there any particular time, or was there any experience of pressure being put by the Indonesian authority to you as the head of the mission back then?
Well, in terms of the political chain of command, as it were, obviously President Habibie dealt with us very much through the then Foreign Minister, Ali Alatas. And there, I think, there was a genuine wish to respect the United Nations, who they, after all, had given the responsibility to carry out this ballot. And on one occasion, President Habibie sent a team of his ministers, Minister Alatas, Minister Muladi, came to Dili. and that would sometimes result in some abatement of the coercive operation of the militia and the Indonesian army. But it's very hard to know exactly what sort of lines of responsibility were operating. Maybe even within the Indonesian army there were dual chains of command, and it was, we tended to come to understand that it was the kind of Kopassus elements that were most involved in the close operation of the militia. So I imagine that President Habibie and Minister Alatas themselves hoped for a vote in favour of autonomy of East Timor remaining in Indonesia, but I believe that they wanted respect for the United Nations in carrying out the ballot, but some of what was happening in the territory was very different.
Throughout the process, you must make a lot of decisions. What was there any decision that you thought it was so tough, so hard, or not easy to make? What would be the decision that was not very easy for you to make?
It was at several stages the decision as to whether to go forward, despite the fact that the security conditions were not as they were supposed to be. The first stage was when we opened registration, and in fact at that stage, when the Secretary General decided we should go ahead with opening registration, he said there would be a further assessment of the security situation halfway through registration, and it would be completed if the security situation had improved. I mean, in truth, the security situation hadn't improved very much by halfway through, but the determination of the Timorese to register meant that we definitely felt that it was right and it was our responsibility to press forward. So I think that was the most difficult moment before the ballot. Although, again, the same question arose as we went forward to polling day itself. But we were constantly consulting the leader of the CNRT, particularly Shanana Gusmao in Jakarta. If he had said, stop, this is too dangerous for my people, we would of course have had to stop. We couldn't have carried this out against the wishes of Timorese leaders. But on the contrary, I think he was very conscious that this was a window of opportunity that might well not open again. We were certainly not going to be able to create better conditions because we did have the eye of the world on East Timor. There were examples from elsewhere, Western Sahara, where the beginning of a process of registration for a referendum had been frustrated, not just for months but for years. And so he always advised us that we should go forward to the ballot, despite knowing the risk that people were taking.
After the referendum, obviously, as soon as the results were announced, the wave of violence scaled up drastically, and there was to a point where Timorese felt that they had not been protected by the UN. When they saw the UN staff flying out of the country, when they saw that there was actually no place for them to go to within the UN. How was it to you as the head of the mission, seeing people who were so determined for their independence, believing so much in the UN, and at some stage had to be left behind?
Yeah, I think that was certainly very traumatic for UNAMET's international staff, because one of the assurances that we had given during the campaign was that the United Nations was going to stay. You could vote safely because the UN was not then going to go away, and therefore to be forced to leave was very bitter. But UNAMET was a UN presence that had no capacity to protect the people of East Timor. In fact, we had no capacity to protect ourselves. What was needed was a very different kind of presence of the international community. And in fact, we didn't leave, UNAMET didn't close until the United Nations had decided on mandating international military intervention in the form of Interfet, because by then that was the only kind of presence that could protect people in East Timor. UNAMET couldn't do so. And although the days between the 4th of September, when I announced the result and major violence broke out, and the 14th of September, which was when the Security Council gave a mandate to Australia and the other countries that formed Interfet, and the 20th of September, when the first Interfet troops arrived, those were very long days, especially for those of us who by then were under siege in the UNAMET compound here in Belide. But that was actually an extraordinarily rapid international mobilization compared with what has happened in any other country. And UNAMET helped bring that about, because the international focus on what you might call the siege of UNAMET in Dili, the fact that our own spokespeople and international journalists who were with us in the compound told that story to the world, the fact that a team from the United Nations Security Council visited us, insisted that General Ranto also come to Dili with them that day. That all played a part in bringing the kind of protection that the people of East Timor needed by then, not alas before many had been killed and so many others driven from their homes and so much destruction wreaked. But I do believe that we played our part in bringing about the kind of intervention that UNAMET couldn't provide and had to be provided in a different way.
In your own view, had that promise not been made to the Timorese, would somehow it have had affected the way Timorese do things at the time, the courage for them to go and vote, and would that have any effect had the Timorese not being given the word that the UN would stay, regardless what happened?
Well, we should ask that question of Timorese rather than of me, but I'm inclined to think that the Timorese were determined to have their say, irrespective of the consequences. And although we did try to offer that reassurance, I'd be surprised if that was really the determining factor, because what was so remarkable about 1999 was the willingness of people to die for the cause of expressing their wish for independence.
And do you think there could have been a different way of doing things back then?
I've certainly asked myself that question many times, but honestly I don't believe so, because as I already said, I mean, it would have been much better if there could have been an international police presence, military presence to assure security during the ballot and after. But there was no way of bringing that about. Portugal and the United Nations in the negotiations with Indonesia couldn't possibly have achieved that, and I don't believe President Habibie, even if he personally had wanted to agree to it, could have been politically strong enough in Jakarta in the face of the TNI and other political elements to agree to that. So I don't think an armed presence during the ballot could have been achieved. And so I think an attempt to insist on that would have lost what I've referred to as the window of opportunity. Others may think of some way that the international community could have done better, but understanding the political realities of the time, I don't see what that could have been. And the speed of international mobilization, in which Of course, it was expressed through the UN, but also United Nations Secretary General Kofi Annan played, I think, the key role in orchestrating the pressure on President Habibie to invite what became Interfet. I think the UN played its role then too.
The intervention in Timor-Leste was quite unique in the sense you have just said it's quite rapid compared to many other instances in the world when it comes to the UN system working out how to solve, to end situations. What was the factor? What was the determining factor that pushed for that rapid intervention? Was there any particular aspect of Timor that was helping to make the international intervention coming so quick?
I don't think it was any one factor. I think it was a remarkable combination of factors. One was the fact that this had been a United Nations responsibility, and therefore, certainly in New York, the member states of the United Nations felt a responsibility. The Security Council at that time was pretty united in support for the UN role in East Timor and even eventually in mandating international military intervention. Today, the United Nations Security Council is unfortunately bitterly divided in so many ways. And Timor had some very good friends. It had very good friends in, of course, in Portugal. Australia itself, there was tremendous popular feeling that also expressed itself through the government. The Timor Solidarity Network that had grown up over the years, the NGOs, the human rights movements, the church, there were popular demonstrations in Portugal. There was a human chain that surrounded the embassies of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It was joined by then President Sampaio and Prime Minister Antonio Guterres, who's arriving here now to take part in this celebration. And then the United States brought its weight to bear, and President Clinton and then through the World Bank and the international financial institutions, there was tremendous pressure mobilized on Indonesia in a very short period of time. But one should also give credit to President Habibie himself, not only for the original decision to allow the referendum, but also for being willing to give Indonesia's consent to military intervention after he had, I think, had quite a difficult period in persuading his own military to agree to that, and he suffered politically for it. It was perhaps part of the reasons why he didn't succeed in continuing as president in Indonesia. So I think many factors, but I think the real thing is that combination of factors, not singling out any one of them.
What has the experience of UNAMET shaped you in terms of your view of Indonesia, the government of Indonesia, the military, and Timor-Leste, the Timorese people? What have you been able to learn from the experience of UNAMET?
Of course, I have tremendous respect for the people of Timor for the reasons we've talked about a great deal in terms of the courage and determination they showed. In the course of the popular consultation, I dealt with many Indonesians from the Foreign Ministry, from the TNI, from the police, and one shouldn't generalize. There were people who were trying to do a proper job, and of course there were Indonesians from the Solidarity Network there who had a different view from the Indonesian army of the history of Indonesia in Timor, and that's true today. But I think unfortunately there are probably still many in Indonesia who don't have what I would regard as a true understanding of the situation, both during the Indonesian occupation and then in 1999. It's very important that the leadership here has created a very positive relationship with Indonesia, and that's obviously hugely important for any country to have good relations with its neighbours. But I would wish that people in Indonesia too would understand fully the story of 1999. And learn lessons of that too for Indonesia itself.
And what has been the biggest impact of UNAMET to you as on a personal level? What has sort of, if something or if there's anything that has made you change because of the experience of UNAMET?
I came to UNAMET and the United Nations as someone who was already a human rights activist. I had worked for Amnesty International, and the first time I became aware of East Timor was through the reporting that we did as Amnesty International. So it naturally strengthened my own commitment to human rights, which I hope I've been able to apply in other United Nations roles as well. But you know, the United Nations is a body of member states before anything else, and they're not all human rights minded. But the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these are the values that ought to be worked for internationally. And the pride I have in UNAMET is that I think it was an occasion when the United Nations did its job in accordance with the proper principles of the United Nations, and I hope that's something that can continue to inspire other people in the UN today.
We are 24 years on. If there was anything you could say about Timor, the way it develops, the way it progresses, what would you say to Timor-Leste? What can you advise Timor-Leste from what you can see today?
I'm now an occasional visitor. I'm no longer, I have been here many times, but not with opportunities to dig deep into how things are today. But I think a country that has a young and rapidly growing population has a major challenge in terms of educating that population in general, but including making sure that population understands where the nation, the country has come from, in understanding its own history. It's one of the reasons why I'm glad to have had the little book I wrote about the experience of 1999 translated into Tetum, so that it can be a bit more widely available. And I think the work that has been done by Timor's own Truth Commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the ongoing work of Centro Nacional Shega, is very important in trying to make sure that all generations, including those who have no memory personally and may not even have learnt from their parents about what happened in 1999, that's important, because that commitment to your country needs to be applied in other ways today to continue to build it as a strong nation with peace amongst different elements of the population and respect for human rights and a vibrant civil society. So I hope that the knowledge of 1999 can continue to be something that has an effect on those who had no personal knowledge of it.
The Tetun version of the book was only launched this morning. What have you written in that book?
It was the story that we've been talking about now, from the context, the negotiations that led to the 5th of May agreement, through the work of UNAMET here, the violence that followed, and the diplomatic activity that led to mandating interfet. So it ends, if you like, with the story of the arrival of internet, which is just more or less soon after I left, and the point at which the UN role became the UN Transitional Administration headed by the late Sergio Vieira de Mello. So I haven't written about that very different period. It really is the period of 1999 and its context.
And just to wrap up the conversation, what do you think the world can learn from the experience of Timor, especially from a person who has led the mission, a very difficult mission to have in Timor?
Well, I think it should learn that the principle of self-determination is one that is a United Nations principle. We can look today at Palestine, for example, where the United Nations fully recognizes that the Palestine people have the right of self-determination, and yet as we talk they're suffering terribly, and it's hard to see how that path goes forward. So I think the same principles and values that were brought to self-determination in Timor-Leste should still be ones that the member states of the United Nations try to apply elsewhere.
Thank you very much once again for giving us your time to do this interview. I hope you enjoy the rest of your stay in Timor, and I believe we'll see you again in the coming years as well, since you are a frequent visitor of Timor-Leste now, and Timor-Leste is grateful to have a person like you, especially in the most difficult days of these people to determine their own destiny back in '99. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Telespectadores GRANDE TV ouvintes Nacional FM. No maluk siran be acompanha live streaming programa idane tanto sirai liur no mostrailaran. Resposta uikus husi Senyor Ian Martin makhodi ini itabanining norohang husi programa idane. Ahau hodi ekipa tomak neran husi skulpa tamba tengke halo entrevista idane ia Ingles tamba limitação ia língua. Mas be agradece vai tebot siran be acompanha ona programa ne husi ini siuto orohang. Hau equipa produção toma kato kalandiak. Obrigado, no adeus.